Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to today's ThinkForest webinar, which is going to dive into the subject of forest-based climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and ask how we can strengthen the contribution of forests to reaching climate goals. I'm Rach Colling, Head of Communications at the European Forest Institute, and I'll be your facilitator for today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to go through some very brief housekeeping issues with you. I see we have almost 100 attendees at the moment, so welcome to you all. Just to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and we will make it available later on the EFI YouTube channel, and we will of course send a link to all participants. If you are sharing information on social media, please feel free to use the ThinkForest hashtag. You'll notice that throughout the event you can ask questions by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please do include your name and organisation and try and keep all contributions brief. We'll try and answer as many questions as possible, but we may need to group some together if necessary. In terms of today's agenda, so that you know what's coming up, we'll start with an opening speech from our ThinkForest President, Janez Potočnik, followed by our keynote speaker, Hans Verkerk. Hans is Principal Scientist in IPCC's Bioeconomy Programme, leading the team on climate smart forestry. And today he's going to be presenting some observations and recommendations from a brand new report on forest-based climate change mitigation and adaptation in Europe. We'll then have a panel discussion for around an hour on how we can implement forest-based climate change mitigation. And there you'll also have a chance to put your questions to the panelists and also to Hans. So let's get going today. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, ThinkForest President Janez Potočnik. He is also co-chair of the International Resource Panel hosted by UNEP, chair of the Forum for the Future of Agriculture and RISE Foundation, and a member of the European Policy Centre's Advisory Council. And Janez has also served, obviously, as European Commissioner for Science and Research and for the Environment. Janez, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rachel. Dear friends, what a strange summer and what an important question. How can forests and wood use help meet climate targets? If one is making so many introductions as I do, it is hard not to repeat itself. But when I was a member of the Commission and they organized the communication day with the BBC experts, the lesson I have remembered most was repeat, repeat, repeat. And when you are fed up with yourself, repeat it again. I'm not yet entirely fed up with myself, but I will anyway repeat some of the messages, which I believe should stay with us. Once again, we see devastating war on our continent due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with enormous human suffering and consequences which deserve immediate attention and help. Alongside and connected to this, food and energy prices are rising. Economies in Europe are stretched due to lack or potential future lack of fuels, in particular gas, food, especially wheat and animal feed, or fuel, or as well as fertilizers, but also other materials like metals needed for energy transition. Our region has exposed itself and we see again our deep fragility, known but ignored in good times. Once again, the summer hits us with fires, floods, storms, everything but summer days we used to enjoy when I was young. Extremely hot days with temperatures around 40 degrees Celsius are not anymore news of the day. And extreme weather events, so rare in the past, are becoming frequent and regular. Slovenia was faced with most devastating forest fire in our precious karst region, where Slovenian people and neighboring countries showed unprecedented level of solidarity to put it out. But the question remains in the air, why we are ready to and able to show our human face and solidarity only when it's already late. And it is too late. Literally fighting climate change by putting out fires, it's not the future we want and dream about, I guess. And once again, the COVID struck with more relaxed and liberal approach. It is hard to avoid to catch it. myself and all my family included, was one of its last victims. Indeed, there are less pressures on hospitals, but there is more and more evidence that we actually do not know the long-term consequences of the disease we will obviously have to live with, at least for some time in the future. All these acute crises we are facing are important to deal with. And I do not envy the national governments in power and also European Commission, nor deny the difficulty they have to face. But at the same time, we are the first generation facing chronic crises, which are truly global in their scope. I have in mind the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, while social fragmentation and inequality continue to deepen. Natural resources, land, water, oil and gas, forests, precious minerals, have been in the human history always closely related to the wealth of nations, but also to the stability challenges, conflicts, and wars, to various crises emerging from their management, access, and benefits, including huge migratory pressures and human suffering linked to this. And we can see, related to the war in Ukraine, that reactions in Europe have been very much also resource related. But natural resource use also sits at the root of the chronic environmental crisis. IRP data tells us that resource use drives 90% of land-related biodiversity loss, 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, and 1/3 of health-related pollution impacts. And the science also tells us that our resource use harbors deep inequalities. High-income countries have benefited most from the resource use and driven the planetary crisis, while emerging and developing countries hold least responsibility and are facing the worst impacts, including the accumulated climate pressures, leading also to the humanitarian crisis we have to deal with. The best and most efficient way to link and boost solutions to any crisis is always to improve resilience. And while delivering crisis-driven short-term answers, we must always have in mind also systemic and geopolitical solutions related to chronic planetary challenges. Trying to heal the acute crisis while stopping healing the chronic ones would never end up well. Prescribing painkillers without connecting or continuing to take systemic medicines, which are often natural resource related, will just lead to new crises where we will be again surprised, searching in panic for some quick fixes and also ad hoc solutions. To address the core drivers, we need to change our approach. Our current focus is on maintaining the existing economic system above all. And as a solution to the triple planetary crisis, governments and decision makers are narrowly looking to decarbonize our current production systems without thinking about what we humans really need. Let me try to explain you what I mean. Think about the solutions you would consider if you would want to decarbonize while at the same time optimize a traditional sector, for example, steel production. If you would want to make steel production as efficient and low carbon as possible, then think about all the options available if you choose focus not on a sector, but instead on what people really need from the service it delivers. This totally changes the optics. It would be wasted to decarbonize the production of steel if that steel is used to produce things we don't really need. Underused cars, underused houses, which contribute to traffic and property market bubbles, but not to real improved human well-being, social prosperity, and equity. Looking at the science, we can see current resource is not contributing to global social prosperity and equity. Countries which need to increase resource use to make necessary improvements to well-being can do so. But the message to high-income countries is clear. Resource use must be reduced. Also, recent IRP co-chair's opinion piece making climate targets achievable, improving well-being through reduced absolute resource use, is clear about that. That doesn't automatically mean a worse quality of life. Many times quite the opposite. For example, take a well-functioning city in Europe with high scores in quality of life. They all provide high levels of active mobility, compact yet balanced neighborhoods, and access to local healthy food. In other words, they deliver a high quality of life through shifts we need for saving virgin resources at scale. By changing the optic from people serving the economy to economy serving the people and putting in the center of our economy humans and human needs rather than maximizing output of traditional production sectors, we can unlock solutions which reduce resource use while simultaneously improve our well-being, improve our resilience. We propose to focus solutions on major systems delivering resource-dependent human needs, nutrition, built environment, sanitation, mobility, and our daily functional needs. Dear friends, all of the above, it's important also to be evaluated through the lenses of one of our most precious natural resource, that is forests. What is the forest potential, and how much can forest-based activities contribute to climate change mitigation? What role do policies play? How can we maximize forest-based climate change mitigation nationally, locally? All these are important questions we want to ask our experts today, starting with the presentation of the new EFI study, Forest-Based Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation by Hans. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Janez, for these very nice introductory words. I'm putting up my screen, but someone else is sharing the screen now. You should be able to see my presentation now. Yeah, so thanks again, Janez, for the kind words. Also, Rach for introducing the presentation, and I'm very happy to be in this webinar today, that we can present the results of our report, which has just been published as well from our website. So in 2015, some 195 countries developed the Paris Agreement, in which they agreed to reduce, to keep the increase in global average temperature below 2 degrees and preferably below 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And achieving these goals requires significant and strong and urgent reductions in the amount of emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, and also at the same time a large uptake or removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. Forests in this context are very interesting because they can remove CO2 from the atmosphere at large scale. While this has been agreed at the global level, there's now a need to move also to implementation. And for example, within Europe, the European Green Deal is one of these ways to implement the agreements. And within the European Green Deal, Europe aims to become the first climate neutral continent. The Green Deal also mentions and focuses on the role of forest and forestry in achieving the climate neutrality targets that have been set. Well, then to implement the European Green Deal, recently a number of legislative proposals and strategies have been published that all try to implement climate change mitigation activities. These include the revised Lucia regulation, the revised Renewable Energy Directive, the Forest Strategy, and some others. Within these policies, several targets have been proposed. So, for example, by 2030, the new or the revised LULUCF strategy sets an emission target, a sink target for the entire LULUCF sector of some 310 megatons CO2 per year by 2030. And for comparison, this would mean some 50 million megatons of CO2 additional compared to what is now happening. By 2035, agriculture and the LULUCF sector are taken together, aiming at climate neutrality for the two sectors, which means that the LULUCF sink should increase to some 360 million tons of CO2 by 2035, which means already 100 million tons of CO2 removals more than what is now achieved by the Lucia sector. And by 2050, there's the overall target to achieve climate neutrality, and there the Lucia sector is needing to compensate for hard to avoid emissions from other emission sectors, requiring that the current sink is almost doubled, and that there are some 170 million tons of CO2 to be removed additionally compared to the current situation. Well, within this context, the members of the Year 5 Multi-Donor Trust Fund have asked for a study. And the study we have published today, and I'm presenting you some of the main findings from the report. So the report has three main aims. So in all of them, we try to review and synthesize the scientific literature on the mitigation potential provided by forest-based activities in the EU, Norway, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. We also try to look at the impacts of climate change on forest ecosystems, forestry, industries, and also at markets. And finally, we looked at policy and tools that can be used and are available for stimulating carbon storage. But within this presentation, I will mainly focus on presenting the mitigation potential that we have reviewed in the literature, and I will shortly touch upon the climate change impacts that are expected on forests and also the dependent industry and markets. So as mentioned, our report or our study focused on a review of the additional forest-based mitigation potential based on studies published in the scientific peer-reviewed literature. So we focus on studies that have been published over the last 10 years and that at least report mitigation potential at the level of a country. We identified some 33 studies, and from these studies we try to collect information on emission reductions or climate change mitigation potential, but with a focus on greenhouse gases. So there can also be climate change impacts related to albedo, so that's the amount of light that's reflected back to the atmosphere. Evapotranspiration and or surface roughness, which are together frequently called or referred to as biophysical effects, which are certainly important, especially also at the local level, but they have not been in the focus of our report. So we focus really on greenhouse gas emissions. From the 33 studies that we identified, we tried to extract all the estimated mitigation potentials, and we tried to categorize them by type of mitigation potential. So we broadly categorize them as protect, manage, restore, or wood use measures. And for example, on the protect, we focus on measures like avoiding deforestation or forest degradation, as well as forest conservation. On the manage, we look at options that look at harvesting or other management activities. On the forest restoration, we look at restoration activities, but also the establishment of new forest through afforestation or reforestation. And finally, of course, we look also at wood use, so that this shifts in wood use to longer-lived products, wood cascading, or increasing material or energy efficiency. So each of these activities, they affect, for example, the carbon balance in forest or the carbon balance in forests and wood products, and some also have substitution effects. But in general, we try to categorize all these activities according to this classification. And before I start with presenting the results of our analysis, I would like to stress already that there's quite a high uncertainty in the results that we'll be presenting, and this is to a large extent, of course, also representing the variability between studies. Different studies use different data. For example, they use different forest area. They use different methods. For example, they use different simulation models for the calculations. Studies applies different system boundaries. For example, they focus on what happens in the forest versus what happens in forest, in wood products, or through avoided emissions. Some studies, the studies vary in the type of potential that is being estimated. Some look at the technical potential, so what is based on current methods, whereas other studies look at economical potentials that take costs into account. And finally, there's also difference in scenarios assumptions, so for example, related to how extreme or how strong a measure is implemented, or what happens in a counterfactual situation. So all these factors contribute to the uncertainty that you will be also seeing in this presentation. So here you see a broad summary of the results that we obtained from the literature review. So you see on the left here the different categories of protect, manage, restore, and wood use. And within these, you see the different forest-based mitigation activities. So forest conservation, avoiding deforestation, and so on. For each of the activities, we show the numbers in between brackets. They indicate the number of studies that we have available or the number of data points. So you can also see to what extent how much data is available to actually come up with these estimates. So when we then actually see, you can see that forest restoration or peatland restoration is giving the largest mitigation potential according to the studies that we have found in the literature. However, this is only based on 2 studies, of which one was not limited to forest. So when we looked at the results and also made a comparison with some national estimates, it became clear that this study was not limited only to forest, but also include peatlands on the other. So therefore, it is probably a large mitigation potential, but as it's not really focused on forest, we will not use it. We will not mention it in the results that I will be presenting later on. Then from all the mitigation activities, the mitigation related to management are considered to give the largest mitigation potentials. So the largest activity, the activity with the largest mitigation potential is then considered decreased forest harvesting, what we of some 78 million tons of CO2 annually. But we also have to immediately say that this is quite often in studies that have looked only at forest ecosystems, and they have quite often ignored also what happens in products and through substitution. So therefore, the estimate may be not comprehensive. At a similar level, also other active management activities can give a large mitigation potential. Such activities include, for example, species or provenance selection, nutrient, water, or disturbance management. So this also gives together quite a large mitigation potential. For increased forest harvesting was not found to give a mitigation potential, but leading to a loss of carbon generally. Other activities that give important mitigation potentials are forest conservation, with focus on storing carbon in forest ecosystems, avoiding deforestation, which is perhaps interesting as Europe has seen quite an expansion of forest area, but still there has been gross deforestation taking place as well. And even if the areas concerned are quite small, they will give immediately a large emission of CO2. So therefore, it's still, I think, a sizable activity where emissions could be saved. Then looking a bit at wood use, we see quite some variability in the results. For example, in the shifts in wood use, we will see, we estimate that on average there is a mitigation benefit, quite small, but you also see with the error bars that there is an enormous range. So you'll see that it can be negative, so that is not good for climate change mitigation. For example, this is based on a study where more wood is assumed to go to construction, but it leads also to additional harvest. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's also a study that focused on increasing wood going for construction, but it was really focusing on reallocation of wood, and there was no change in the harvest. So shifts in wood use can give mitigation potential, but it will strongly depend on how it's implemented. Interestingly, we also found a very small and even negative mitigation potential for cascading. What we consider this is quite a bit due to the very small number of estimates that are available in the literature, perhaps relatively modest assumptions made in this scenario, and one single estimate or one single scenario with a large negative estimate for energy cascading. So these are the results at the EU level, or EU, Norway, Switzerland, and UK. But then we can also dive a little bit into the results for the individual countries. But I have to also immediately say that the numbers that you see here in this graph do not add up to the graph that I showed in the previous on the previous slide. Main reason is that many studies, they provide an estimate at EU level, but they do not estimate necessary mitigation potentials at country level. So you will see that there's the largest mitigation potentials are within Sweden, Finland, Spain, France, and Poland. But this is also to a large extent just to the sheer size of these countries and the size of the forest resources. So if you have it's a large country with a lot of forest or productive forest, there will also be immediately quite a large mitigation potential. From the results that we have for these countries, it becomes also clear that management seems to be the most promising, or the mitigation activity that gives the largest mitigation potential. Within the literature, there is quite some focus. Several studies have estimated mitigation potentials, but they're quite often it's a mix of technical and cost-effective mitigation potentials. So with technical, we mean what is biophysically possible with current methods and technologies. And with cost-effective, we focus on measures that are available at a certain, that consider also cost. A study has been recently published by Stephanie Rowe, who's also one of the panelists, where they looked at studies that have estimated both a technical and a cost-effective potential. And their results indicate that roughly 25% of what is technically possible is also cost-effective at the cost of some $100 per ton of CO2. However, we also have to stress that the literature on this is quite thin. So there's not too many studies that have estimated the cost-effectiveness of forest-based mitigation, which also indicates an important knowledge gap. Besides their importance of forest and use for climate change mitigation, forests and the forest markets and industry, they're also affected by climate change. So we also try to review how climate change is affecting forests and product markets and industry. So we try to categorize this or present this by focusing on productivity changes, shifts in tree species ranges, increasing disturbances, as well as disrupting markets. So what we see in the literature is that several model-based estimates exist, and they generally confirm that we see productivity increases in central and north of Europe and decreases in the south. But there is still uncertainty whether CO2 fertilization, so that more efficient photosynthesis, will actually strengthen productivity. Another factor that is uncertain is whether the increased productivity will actually result in more carbon stored in long-lived tree compartments, or whether there's allocation of more of carbon to more shorter-lived tree compartments like foliage or roots. Considering tree species shifts, several tree species distribution modeling efforts show that in a wide range of climate scenarios that we will see the important range shifts, especially in the second half of this century. And that means we can see range contractions, especially from on the south and on the east side. But for some species, this will also be compensated by a range increase in the north. But nevertheless, these range shifts will have a strong implication, could have a strong implication on carbon sequestration in forests. Janez already mentioned disturbances in this introduction, and we will see that disturbances are expected to increase. And some simulation studies also even indicate that they can reduce potential productivity gains that can be estimated, or they can even amplify productivity losses. But it's also clear that estimating disturbances, especially at large scale, is still quite complicated. But those studies that have made such effort indicate there can still be substantial releases of stored carbon as a result of disturbances such as wind, fire, and bark beetle outbreaks. And finally, which is a little bit less investigated in the literature, there can also be an effect of climate change on forest product markets. Forest product industry and markets. So this can be, for example, that due to warming, there will be less opportunities for winter harvesting in some countries, which may lead to increased damage or increased harvesting costs. There may be effects of productivity changes also on the wood quality, as wood density may change, and also disturbances can cause large peaks or large fluctuations with sudden large supplies of woody biomass, which also may have impacts on the longer term. So adaptation measures are needed, but even some of these adaptation measures may lead to changes in the assortments that industry will have to work with. So then we looked at how the different mitigation activities affect each other, but also how they affect, for example, on adaptation or on biodiversity. So there are several measures that affect and interact with each other. So, for example, measures that focus on conservation will be hard to combine with measures that focus on active management. Of course, you can do this within a landscape where you assign different parts of the forest to different activities. But in principle, there is still difficult to combine these everywhere in the forest. But when we look at those activities that we have, mitigation activities that we have identified, and also when we look how they affect or link with adaptation and biodiversity, we find that, for example, avoiding deforestation, afforestation and reforestation, as well as all the wood use options can be combined with each other, with relatively limited effect on each other, and they may also have limited effect on adaptation and biodiversity. So when we take this into account, we try to bundle each of the different mitigation activities that we have identified previously to come up with a total mitigation potential, and also to indicate what is more or less the option space that is available. So when we combine avoided deforestation with activities focusing on afforestation and on wood use, which we believe can be combined easily without too much effect on each other, we come up with an EU level mitigation potential of some 72 million tons of CO2. When we combine these activities with forest conservation, this would increase to some 125 million tons, or when we combine with other active management, it would increase to some 138 million tons, or when we combine it with decreased forest harvest, it would increase to 143 million tons of CO2. So the option space that we broadly define is between 125 to 143 million tons of CO2, with the comment that not all of the studies have consistently considered all relevant carbon pools. So to summarize, when I come back to the policy targets that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, by 2030, some 50 million tons of CO2 is additionally needed according to the revised UNICEF regulation, and this increases to some 170 million tons of CO2 by 2050. According to our results, the available peer-reviewed scientific literature suggests that forest-based mitigation activities could remove an additional 125 to 143 million tons of CO2 per year by 2050. And this will indicate that it will be actually challenging to meet the targets that have been set by the European Commission. Moreover, there is quite limited information currently available at the cost effectiveness of these, at the related cost to achieve this mitigation potential. We would like to also stress that a holistic approach is needed when we look at the climate change mitigation potential. So this is needed both in policy, but certainly also in research. And with this we mean that the approach must be covering all relevant carbon pools and fluxes of the forest ecosystem, so biomass, dead wood, and soil. Needs to consider wood products, avoided emissions through material and energy substitution, as well as any leakage and rebound effects that can happen up to and beyond 2050. Importantly, it needs also to consider interactions with any other sectors, because they are not independent from each other. If there's bioenergy policies being formulated that rely on the use of wood, this can have implications on carbon uptake in carbon sequestration in forests. Similarly, if activities are taken in agriculture, or if we focus on afforestation, this will also have implications for what can be achieved in agriculture. So it is really that all there's interaction to be considered also with other sectors. So based on our findings, we come up with some 7 recommendations, and you see the first 3 here on the slide. So according to our results, and according to the available scientific literature, mitigation activities that rely on European forest and wood products can provide a significant contribution to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. But the mitigation potential is also finite. There's a limit. This means it cannot compensate for delayed actions in any of the other sectors that are there. Similarly, if the LULUCF sector is not able to meet its policy targets, that means that also stronger emission reductions are needed in other sectors, or a stronger reliance on other carbon removal technologies, of which many are actually still unproven. So the technology, the capacities, and the strategies to deploy forest-based mitigation activities at large scale exist. We have used them already for many years, and all the knowledge is there. So we really think that maximum efforts are needed to reduce net emissions, starting with the most sustainable and cost-efficient mitigation activities. As our second recommendation, we highlighted that there are several mitigation activities that can be applied, but rather it should not be focused. One should not focus on one single mitigation activity, but consider all the mitigation activities that exist, as well as their synergies, interactions, co-benefits, and regional applicability. This must consider all the relevant carbon pools and flows, and also how this develops over time. And this requires better integration across policy activities such as forestry, biodiversity, bioeconomy, climate, energy. This needs to be done at all policy levels. As a third recommendation, which focuses a bit more on wood use, the availability of woody biomass to replace all fossil products will be vastly insufficient. And therefore, focus will need to be made on which products give the largest emission reductions. Quite often, there's a focus on shifting wood use to more long-lived products, for example, in construction, or to avoid the direct use of harvested wood for energy purposes. While these will certainly give benefits, there are also other wood use options that may give even larger benefits. So the focus should be really on those measures that give the largest emission reductions. At the same time, to do this will require that we develop new production technologies that rely on biomass, for example, from byproducts or side streams, need better new wood waste collection systems, and already consider in the product design stage how recycling and reuse can be implemented. Then we move to our fourth recommendation. As already indicated before, in some countries, the mitigation activities that focus on forest management give larger mitigation benefits. For example, activities that focus on afforestation. So this is just to illustrate that the mitigation activities are depending on where you are. So forests across countries differ, and therefore also the implementation strategies need to be taking into account the regional conditions. Many policies and strategies have been recently developed, especially at the European level as part of the European Green Deal, but there's now really a need to move on towards the implementation of these activities at all policy levels. This requires, for example, appropriate incentive systems to implement mitigation activities, but it can also be an exchange of best practices between countries and regions. And we also need transparent, harmonized, and a robust monitoring framework to monitor the effectiveness of the activities that are taken. While forests are certainly important for climate change, we have also shown and reviewed that forests will be affected by climate change. Whereas many of the policy focus on mitigation only, the adaptation part is still relatively weakly considered, but it's really important to strengthen the forest, the resilience of European forests, also to ensure that they can contribute to climate change mitigation by 2050 and beyond. And this also links directly with their final recommendations. The focus should be beyond 2050 only. Many of the policy targets currently focus on 2050, but also many of the impacts of climate change will happen after 2050. Climate change will continue after 2050, and therefore also the policy should be extending their focus. So this was basically the study that we presented, and we also have identified several gaps that exist and options that mitigation options that are not well understood. But this opportunity, I would like to take the opportunity for this during this presentation also to highlight the new Forest Path project that started just at the beginning of this month and will be lasting for 4.5 years. So Forest Paths will have a similar starting point as the study that I just presented. But it will try to co-design, quantify, and evaluate holistic forest-based policy pathways to optimize the contribution of EU forest and the forest-based sector to climate change mitigation, but also to take into account the needs to adapt to the impact of climate change, conserve biodiversity, and sustain ecosystem service provisioning. Within the project, we will organize a series of policy labs, and we will try to involve as many of the policy makers and other stakeholders in our study as possible. The project has just started, but if you're interested, please follow us on social media. Then I come to the end of this presentation, and I would also like to thank all the co-authors of this report. As a personal note, I have really enjoyed working with all of you. It has been a pleasure to work with you on the report, and I would like to thank you for that. And I also hope that the report that we produce is of interest to all the people that are in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. As Hans mentioned, the new study and the related policy brief are published today, and you can find more information on the EFI website. We'll send the links to all the participants, and I'll also drop them into the chat box during the panel discussion, which is what we're going to move on to now next. If you do have any specific questions directed at Hans, please do pop them in the question and answer box, and we'll take a look at them later on. So I'll hand over again now back to Janez, who is going to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Rach. I would just advise one thing before I go with the presentation of the panelists, because some questions already arrived in Q&A. And some are pretty straightforward with the answer yes and no. So maybe there is a possibility for Hans also to answer them directly in Q&A. And some of them could be by our panel, which I will now present, explained, because two of the colleagues were also the authors in the preparation of the report. But let me start by the introduction of the panelists. Simon Kay is Deputy Head of the Unit, Land Economy and Carbon Removals of the Director General for Climate Action of the European Commission. After obtaining his PhD from the University College London on the use of remote sensing to monitor agriculture, he worked for nearly 2 decades in applied research. Since 2013, he has been deeply involved in the formulation of the third pillar of the European Union's 2030 climate policy framework concerning land use and focusing on agriculture and forestry. So happy to have you, Simon. Lucia Perugini is a senior scientific manager at the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. She has PhD in forest ecology with scientific background in forest and climate change since 2003. She has been involved in UNFCCC negotiations, providing technical scientific support to the Italian delegation. Besides her scientific research, she is currently the Italian representative in the Working Group 5 at the EU Climate Change Committee on implementation of the LULUCF decision. So welcome, Lucia. Then Stephanie Rowe, as WWF Global Climate and Energy Lead Scientist. Stephanie works with WWF network and external collaborators to advance the science, leadership, and progress on climate mitigation, climate resilience, and nature-based solutions across sectors and disciplines. Stephanie holds a PhD in environmental sciences from the University of Virginia, and she's also an IPCC lead author. Great to have you, Stephanie, also with us. And if you were carefully watching the last slide, which was presented by Hans, you have seen that Lucia and Stephanie were co-authors of the study presented by Hans. And finally, Daniel Ibanez, it's a Spanish practicing architect, urbanist, and director of Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia. He holds a Doctor of Design degree from the Harvard University. His professional research and academic focus is on the architectural and urban implications of renewable carbon-storing biomaterials in construction. He is building the tallest social housing mass timber building in Spain. Many thanks also to you, Daniel, for joining us. Before we start our panel discussion, I would like to ask you, webinar participants, to please put your questions in the chat. My colleague, Reg, will collect them so that we can later post them to the panelists. And please, if you have a question, it would be also good if you would indicate your preference, whom you would like that this question is addressed and who would you like the question to be answered. So, and by the way, Hans, if you would like to enter into debate, please do indicate also in the chat that there are some particular questions which you would like to answer, not only in written, but also orally. Which brings me to the first question round. So we now start with looking more into the aspects of implementation, and therefore would like to gain some insights in how European Union aims to reach its climate goals, how forest-based climate change mitigation can be maximized nationally, as well as what we can learn from other parts of the world to reach climate neutrality before we turn to architecture and construction to hear more about enablers and barriers for the use of the wood. So please be punctual, try to answer quickly, short. We have some 45 minutes till the end of our webinar, and I would start with you, Simon. How do you see that EU will reach the ambitious climate goals 2030, 2050? A very simple question with, I guess, a bit complicated answer.
No, but I will also, thanks so much, Janez, also for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be with this panel. Very interesting and pertinent discussion indeed, as has been mentioned. I won't go more into that, but indeed, I think we can put it across quite simply. I mean, I will name check a little bit the work done by the Commission leading up to the proposals for 2050 and for 2030. So already a few years ago now, communication from the Commission came out, the so-called Clean Planet Communication 2018, where we looked at the pathway for 2050. And one of the key shifts in that communication compared to, if you like, the thinking beforehand was that removals, that the way that land plays a role is different. The goals that we had for 2030, the legislation adopted in 2016 to 2018, focuses on only emission reductions with a little bit played by LULUCF. Whereas from 2018 onwards, our thinking changed, and we realized that to get well under 2 degrees, to get closer to the 1.5 degree warming goal, we needed to look at what we did with sequestering carbon, whether in nature-based systems or in technical systems. So the Clean Planet Communication starts by putting forward several pathways with different types of uses, different types of uses of biomass in different land, let's say, hypotheses. What I want to emphasize that it definitely underpins the need for emission reduction. So whereas the previous mindset, if you like, was that there should be at least 80% emission reduction compared to 1990 by 2050. By this time, we realized it had to be nearer 90%. And what this basically means is that when you reduce the EU's emissions by 90% by 2050, you have about 500 megatons left over, more or less. And so there would need to be a balancing of that of around 500 megatons of removals. So how do we get there? And I think this was the first step that leads us to the climate law that was adopted in 2021 with the goal of balanced emissions and removals by 2050. Then the next evaluation of where to go was the climate target plan. So if you like, the famous minus 55 behind the Fit for 55. And there again, we also have sector level targets, including for LULUCF. And I think that Hans has presented it very appropriately, that he put forward a slide, and on his summary even, that there was about an extra 50 million tons of mitigation in LULUCF would be needed by 2030. I'd just like to point out that for 2035 and 2050, we don't have targets for LULUCF in our proposals. We have discussions of how to arrive at them, and climate neutrality for AFLU, agriculture, forestry, land use by 2035, but these are more exercises in where we would go rather than numbers. So the only numbers on the discussion today are for 2030. And another important point is it's not just forest. And I know that the community here is probably thinking forest, it's going to have to do it all. No. In the impact assessment, for example, for LULUCF, for our proposal, we identified that on organic soils, and I know that Janez, you're also very attached to what can be done with soils, that about 40 megatons can be done very cost effectively. Of this extra 50, maybe 3/4 of it could be done with action on soil. So we don't try to pin the tail just on one part of the donkey, and we look to see what can be done in different places across the EU 27. Yes, there is a lot of potential clearly in forest, but not necessarily the right potential and not necessarily cost effective. So yeah, I probably used up already too much time, but just to say we need to get on the pathway for 2050 by 2030, and that's the objective. So it's to get us in that direction, because at the moment we're going away from the 500 megatons that we would need in 2050, and it's to get us in that other direction that we need to look at all the sectors, all the subsectors in LULUCF, not just forest, but yes, absolutely, we need to make sure we get removals done, and not forgetting we need to also reduce emissions, otherwise we're going to have a bigger job with removals. And I'll leave the floor to the next question or any questions to come up in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simon. Very clear and very straight to the point. Lucia, you are very active on the national level. So pretty much the same question to you, how to maximize forest-based climate change mitigation, but looking through the national, local perspective.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, bringing all these targets and very, I would say, demanding targets to the local level, it's quite challenging. As we have seen through the presentation of Hans, the forestry sector is a strongly interconnected sector with other, like energy, construction, but also agriculture. When you there is a wide variety of conditions and circumstances across Europe, that we may have LULUCF sector, land use change sector as a sink or as a source moving across Europe. So we really need to face at local level to a great variety, but also different interest over on the same land. If we picture a forest land in our mind, I may see the mushrooms and think about my risotto, while Stephanie probably may see a nice biodiverse forest, while Simon would clearly see an opportunity for carbon sequestration or nice construction material for Daniel. So, and then you need to reconcile all these interests, and how to achieve mitigation is actually to increase the growth of the forest and reduce as much as possible, or I mean, find the best way to tailor the harvesting in a way that doesn't deplete the growing potential of the forest. And also, we need to consider also that we are seeing across Europe a decrease in zinc across all forests, mainly due to aging of forests, or natural aging of forests. So many are coming to the harvesting age, so closing the harvesting cycle. There is an increase of impact of disturbances like fire, pest, and disease across Europe. So there are multiple challenges that needs to be addressed at local level. So how to address and how interconnect this vertically across all the different layers of governance and horizontally across the different sectors. This is something that we need to face with the local practitioners and farmers and foresters, and understanding the different perspectives, let them fully aware of what is at stake, what are the challenges, and also understand from them what are their needs and what are their barriers to achieve the different objectives. So this exchange and interaction is key to understand what is the best option, because we don't have a single recipe for all Europe. It's impossible to find one. It's important to integrate mitigation options with adaptation, so we cannot disentangle these two concepts at all. We need to face them together and work with local farmers and foresters, and also across sectors to reconcile all the different interests to find the best solution for all.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you a lot. And we are now turning to Stephanie. Stephanie, given that you worked a lot in the tropics, so on the global level, what can the European Union learn about the implementation from the rest of the world, from this global perspective?
Thanks, Janez, and thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. And before I start, I just want to, highlight that Hans outlined various best practices and recommendations for the implementation of forest policies and interventions in the report. So I just want to mention that first and recommend that you all read the report recommendations. And as Lucia said, interventions it's critical that interventions are customized to the local and country context. And I think that I personally, and we, WWF as an organization, has seen the most successful interventions be customized and catered to that local context, whether it's the forest type in the biome, to the management type or the type of governance, or the land use planning of the landscape, to the various needs of the local community. And when they are done, so successful interventions or sustainable interventions are usually both in tropical and temperate forests, say in the US and Canada, are the most successful when they reconcile various perspectives across the landscape. So a purely top-down approach we've seen has generally not received the buy-in needed to be sustainable long-term, whereas a bottom-up approach that negotiates the multiple interests that Lucia mentioned across forest owners, scientists, industry, community, is usually much more sustainable and equitable long-term. And it's much more able to balance conservation and production goals. In the EU, I imagine that the scales and stakeholders would also have to include different member states, of course, and their differing pressures and needs and goals and capacities. The other component that we've seen quite a bit of successes is a delivery of multiple benefits, including biodiversity or watershed protection, erosion control, provision of income to local communities, as well as other ecosystem services, but those benefits have to be considered and incorporated upfront in the design and management plan, from the beginning, from the outset. Otherwise, they simply kind of become an afterthought or are even negatively affected. So in the example of reforestation, afforestation efforts, large-scale efforts in China and India, for example, where we've seen kind of large-scale tree planting to avoid erosion and or improve water retention. They've actually, done kind of monoculture in some areas. They've done monoculture tree plantations that have actually reduced biodiversity in the area and reduce the water content. And so they've had to then rip up all those trees and have to redo it again. And so, the fact that they have to be considered at the outset is very important. And then Lucia also mentioned this, but, of course, forest resilience and climate adaptation is going to be needed it needs to be integrated into any climate mitigation intervention. And so management plans and policies will need to be much longer term, for example, beyond 2050, to adequately account for future climate change impacts as well. And then I will just end finally with one last point, is that you can only learn and improve on forest interventions and measures if you know how well they're delivering on their intended goals. So robust and transparent and harmonized research, monitoring, and evaluation systems are extremely helpful for scaling up successes and improving on shortcomings, but also detecting when things are going wrong immediately. So, Brazil earlier on had quite some successes in their monitoring systems on forests. And also it provides additional data to the world. As the report shows, there's currently very little data on, for example, bioenergy and bioeconomy, on climate mitigation across their life cycle. So it can provide kind of a rich set of data for the community also to look at. And I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Stephanie. And last but not least, Daniel. Since, by the way, I'm just right now moving from a bigger house to a smaller house, and the new one, it's of course wood-based. I would be very interested of your optic. What are the barriers and enablers for the wood, engineered wood, in architecture and construction in that perspective?
Thank you so much for the invitation, Janez. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just say up front also that I'm very happy that, architects are talking with, experts, scientists, forest engineers, ecologists. I mean, this is really fantastic. And I always appreciate to have, conversations about the full value chain of things rather than these kind of disciplinary silos. So this is really exciting for me. I'm learning a lot. From what I can contribute to this, particular panel, being, an architect with a certain sensibility towards all these ecological, environmental questions that has been raised previously, I could say, a few things. On the barrier side, so what are the things that are preventing a better use of these engineered wood products? So right now we find that one of the biggest problems is probably the policy aspect, right? I mean, we don't have yet, I would say it's not very even throughout Europe, but we don't have yet the right regulatory frameworks that can enable and somehow incentivize this type of construction. We have heard recently, countries like France passing this kind of law that, states that, by the end of this year, probably 50% of all the buildings that are publicly subsidized by the French Republic will have to be built with renewable materials or wood. And we see these kind of policies happening in a central country such as France, but yet other countries like the one I find myself, like in Spain, we are way behind on that thing. There are obviously some other barriers that, you know, have historically been very present, you know, especially the cultural ones, right? I mean, like still there is a certain fear to kind of like building dense and building tall with, you know, with this kind of like products, mostly derived from, you know, previous instances when, you know, the use of this material, you know, forced kind of like fires or issues of this sort. We know now that the technology is ready and is absolutely, you know, proof towards all these kind of issues, yet the cultural dimension needs to be also kind of like overcome. So the more projects start to emerge, the more this is properly kind of like framed and disseminated. Probably one of those barriers or this barrier will gradually dissolve. And lastly, on the barriers that I think are preventing mostly, is also the activation of the demand side. We know that many of these things you know, start to catalyze when there is active demand, and I see that still you know, both public and private you know, agents are still not being very upfront and really understanding the need for that. We are seeing also some, you know, green sprouts and few initiatives that are promising, but yet this is, you know, it's still, this requires both the private and the public institutions to jump in. What can you know, enable this? You know, let's see a little bit on the positive side. So, you know, I hope first of all that you know, these new policies and regulations start to kind of like take place in all countries, not only specifically for mass timber construction, but also for, you know, incentivizing low embedded carbon in construction, and policies around that. We also see that, you know, this change is going to be enabled by younger generations demanding, you know, new type of buildings. They are being much more aware about the you know, the planetary climate crisis, and they want to be kind of, you know, buying or accessing housing that they know they are you know, coming from fossil fuel you know, energies for the construction. And maybe lastly, I would also say that one of the key enablers, I believe, is also that in the last, especially 20 years, I would say 30 years, we have seen huge amount of development of on all these engineered mass timber products that somehow are providing the right let's say commodity to really build solving these two problems that we have: keep housing and an increasing population, but simultaneously using buildings as carbon sinks, really enhancing the role of buildings as decarbonizers of the built environment.
Thanks, Daniel. Now, since we have finished the round number 1, I would ask Reg, because you are keeping an eye on the questions, where we are standing. Are there some interesting questions our panelists should address?
Yes, there are indeed. Hans has been busy answering some of them already, but I have another one for him, in fact, from Daniel Reinemann, who is asking if it's possible to specify what practices and activities are included under active forest management, and what can really have the biggest climate mitigation impact.
Yeah, thanks, Rach, for the question. I was trying to follow the questions that are coming in, but I noticed it's then also difficult to follow the panel at the same time. I got to unmute the so I would like to stress that in this study we did a review, so we really depend also on what is published within the literature. So we collected a large number of studies that have been published, and we try to categorize them to give some logic to them. So what is exactly included in all the measures is not always entirely clear what specific assumptions have been made. But when we try to classify the studies, of course, we try to list also the type of activities that we want to see in each class of activities. So, for example, on the other active management, we try to group studies that have included provenance selection, tree species selection, nutrient management, including biochar, disturbance management, and also hydrology management. So if these studies have included these, we try to group it under the active forest management. Also, some studies, they just have a general class on improved forest management, especially if there are global studies. So it's not always very easy to directly say which precise measure gives the largest mitigation potential. I think we did this together with Stephanie. I don't know if she would like to complement something on this.
Stephanie is happy.
Okay.
Okay. Reg, should we continue to the second question round, and you will keep?
We'll continue, and we'll keep looking in the question box, and we'll see what we can answer directly. I think there's one for Stephanie, for example, that maybe she can give a written reply to rather than doing it verbally.
Thanks. So if we go to the second question round now, we would like to dig a bit little deeper and ask how, for example, European Commission will support the policy's implementation, talk about how to strengthen science policy dialogue in this regard. And in this perspective, it will be also interesting to learn about the second crisis, which is connected to that. That's the biodiversity crisis, and how the loss of biodiversity can be minimized by the implementation of climate change mitigation. And then we can turn towards the role of mass timber buildings for the decarbonization, which brings me again back to you, Simon, and the European perspective to those questions. What does the European Commission believe can be done to support the implementation, in particular in the terms of how to help the member states in that efforts?
Okay, so it's a lot of interconnecting things really, but so there's probably not one bullet that really solves how these things can be done. I think the diversity also of the systems across the EU is also going to dictate that we need to have different ways of challenging the problems that we have. But one very common factor, and Stephanie raised it a little bit earlier, is about monitoring. And in our proposal for the revision of the LULUCF regulation, we also want to enhance the way that LULUCF removals are going to be monitored. And in particular, we focus on where there is, if you like, co-policy action with biodiversity, with the exploitation of, or protection, in fact, of areas under the Renewable Energy Directive, and also in respect of adaptation. So let's take adaptation when we know that there is an area that is subject to climate change risks, that we should be very careful about what we do in terms of adaptation and what consequence this might have on the removal potential or the removals that are taking place in that zone. And also, at the same time, we expect there to be monitoring for biodiversity to be taking place. That's under a different policy framework, different legislative proposal, but we want to make sure these are synergistic. So improving monitoring methods is really key. Absolutely agree with Stephanie's points on there. Also, in terms of tackling the impacts of natural disturbance and climate change, you mentioned at the beginning, this is going to be crucial as well over the decades that come. Second important point is the regulatory frame that we propose. So if you like, the targets is very open. We don't say everybody should achieve with this kind of forest management, this kind of result. The choices of how to blend action on agricultural land, action on wetlands, action in the forest, action in materials is up to the member state to try to combine. So this is important to keep this in mind. And then how to bring this knowledge together. And I think this is something that is important through EU measures again, through research projects. The one that I've just learned that Effie is associated with one I didn't know about, but exactly that kind of project. And the sharing of knowledge in order to use this to optimally develop the policies and measures that would be done in member states. And the last point really to I think is worth highlighting is that we want to provide new pathways for increasing removals. And it's great that Danielle is indeed on the panel today, because this is one of our we're very interested in how buildings and materials produced from wood, and I don't mean just the classical 3 HWP products that are in the LULUCF regulation, but innovative materials can be brought into a framework and used to support the rollout of more removals through carbon markets and through a certification process. So we have a proposal coming out at the end of this year on how to certify that this kind of building material would contribute in this level towards removals. And I think that's very important to standardize it and have that accepted so that then investment can flow, and that builds more of an interest for people to downsize from a good sized apartment to a smaller sized wooden house, and they know that it will contribute in a certain way towards the removals. And I think this is also going to be more and more common. I'm being a little bit teasing there, but what I mean is it's going to be important that our actions are able to acknowledge that kind of thing. So those are the most important points I would say at the moment that we see of a way that the EU can help foster that kind of mindset change.
Thank you, Simon. Since I'm also co-chairing the science policy interface, and I'm pretty much aware how difficult it is that we have a proper flow of scientific knowledge to the policymakers, but on the other hand, that also the scientists understand very well that this needs to have quite some knowledge also in how to communicate. The question to you, Lucia, how do you think we could strengthen in this area the science policy dialogue?
Yeah, thank you. It's really a challenging question, and allow me to touch upon two different aspects. The first one is how to communicate the complexity and all the issues that we were touching upon during this conversation to the wide society. So I think it's broader than just science and policy dialogue, but also communication in a broader sense to the civil society to make all more aware of the complexity around the function of forest and climate change and the interaction with biodiversity and energy and construction. And so this is very important, because then the more aware society you have and the more conscious policymaker you may have. We are close to the election, so I'm very sensible to this point. The second layer I wanted to touch upon is what the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said at COP25, presenting the Green Deal, is what gets measured gets done. So this is very a key concept that Simon has just mentioned, where really science community are asked to provide their inputs and useful inputs. So monitoring tools, better understanding of the dynamics, forest dynamics, and in a rapidly changing world is key and is essential to build informed policies. And the target of this exchange should be, especially, and one aspect is to improve the inventory, the greenhouse gas inventory, which is the main tool used by policymakers to assess their policy directions and really see how to alter the emission trends. So there are many projects that are dealing with this interaction between scientific community and inventory community. It's not easy. It's not trivial, because inventory communities are tied to well-prescribed rules and guidelines provided by the IPCC and the rules under the UNFCCC, while scientists are less constrained in their, but still a common understanding, a common terminology needs to be built between the two communities, and it's a work that is more and more engaging the two communities, especially with the use of Earth observation and also inverse model with the measurements from the Earth observation of the gases that are really can provide a near real-time CO2 emissions measurements, and all these new upcoming and fast evolving knowledge needs to be really rightly brought to the inventory community in the right way, and increase awareness of this community, of the inventory community, of the existence of this tool. So I think this is a key issue that needs to be reinforced between the two communities to improve also the greenhouse gas inventory and get better, let's say, results of in our action.
Thank you, Lucia. More and more, we are getting aware that that policies which are targeted to only single goals will not deliver properly. Stephanie, how do you see it would be best to factor, for example, biodiversity concerns into climate policies in practice?
Thanks, Janez. Yeah, as we highlight in the report, there are various forest-based mitigation measures that can both positively or negatively affect or impact biodiversity. So for example, afforestation of natural grasslands or bogs and fens can generally reduce biodiversity of those ecosystems. And similarly, forest management activities that increase wood harvest and decrease habitat simultaneously could reduce biodiversity. On the other hand, restoration of degraded forests or forest management to reduce disturbances and disease, as well as certain forest conservation activities, have great potential to enhance biodiversity. And I'll just reiterate what I said before, is that policies and activities can deliver biodiversity benefits when they're considered and incorporated in the outset. So in the design and management plan from the beginning. So, for any policies and interventions that are planned in forest ecosystems, biodiversity impacts will need to be assessed upfront. And then in terms of implementation, what we've seen also is that there's certain gaps that need to be addressed to be able to deliver on certain biodiversity benefits. So for example, reforestation or restoration of forest ecosystems to enhance biodiversity need to have nurseries that have more diverse and native tree species. And oftentimes in countries, those are lacking or don't exist. And so making sure that those are funded and supported. And then, finally, of course, biodiversity should also be considered in the monitoring and evaluation of any forest-based measure as an outcome. And lastly, I'll just say that biodiversity, of course, covers a range of definitions and measurements from abundance and rarity of different species and the types of species from vegetation, mammals, birds, amphibians, insects, keystone species, etc. So these will also need to be considered in the impact assessment, design, planning, as well as monitoring and evaluation, and any kind of framework that is kind of more harmonized at a landscape or a national level. I'll end it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephanie. Daniel, we know quite well that there are three most resource-intensive human needs which are connected to mobility, to food, and to built environment. So built environment, it's obviously an important part of our human needs, which would need to be addressed and brought to a more sustainable future. How do you see the role of mass timber buildings in these decarbonization efforts there?
Yeah, fantastic question, Janez. So, as I was saying before, mass timber could enable us to tackle two challenges simultaneously. On the one hand, it can enable a construction product that can house this increasing population. Remember that we are projected to be 10 billion people by 2050. But if done right, and if sourced locally from sustainable, managed kind of like forest, following pretty much what has been discussed today, we can also do that in a way that also those buildings that are needed for the increasing population are also playing an ecological role, the role of storing that carbon securely and enabling that forest to keep, sequestering more. So why mass timber? I mean, I think, cities in general, as you were saying, play a fundamental role in absorbing these CO2 emissions, and thus, it's a big opportunity to keep us below those, 1.5 or 2 degrees of global warmings. One of the, let's say, not discoveries, but one of the recent, realizations recently was that, we have historically as architects put a lot of emphasis on the energy and emissions that go into the operations of buildings. But all, the research that is telling us now is that, the operations of buildings, how much energy we use and, what are the resources we consume in the daily maintenance, on the daily use of that building, only account sometimes for 30 or 25% of the whole emissions and the whole embedded energy in the process. Actually, where most of that process occurs is during construction. So in that sense, knowing what materials to build with, where are they coming from, what are these embedded footprints is a fundamental area of really tackling the decarbonization of the built environment. So if done right, by increasing the amount of square meters built with mass timber, we can, as I was mentioning, reduce CO2 emissions associated with the building sector, but also accelerate to the ecological transition of the built environment. The numbers, I'm sure you know much better than me, but roughly 38% of the global emissions are caused by the built environment, and 10% of the total global emissions are related specifically with the use of material. So we have been working, as educators, but also as kind of practitioners with this framework of the 3S, right? First of all, trying to substitute fossil fuel materialities like iron and kind of concrete towards more renewable biogenic materialities such as mass timber. The second S is try to sink as much of that carbon in probably the safest place that you can store, CO2 absorbed carbon, let's say in mass timber, right? Which is a building that typically lasts very long, is well maintained. So it really operates as a kind of carbon bank or carbon kind of sink. And then the last S is this idea of allowing further sequestration of carbon by, again, allowing more space in the forest to keep growing, and kind of like more trees. And again, I'm not an expert on that, but all the science as it was presented today tells that if we do that process well, we can actually sequester more carbon, as if we basically don't manage actively our forest. So I think all these aspects are really positioning mass timber buildings as one of the very important contributions in the decarbonization of the built environment.
Thanks a lot. Since we are slowly coming to the end of our time, before I ask you, all four of you, for not more than few words in which you would actually point to most important thing you consider as how to reach climate neutrality with support of the forests, I would ask Reg if there is any question which is urgent and we need to address it.
Actually, there's a very interesting, very short follow-up question for Daniel. He was mentioning the use of materials, and it was a question from Sylvia Meligari, which was that, do you think that adding a measurement for carbon storage in products could help architects to better compare materials when they're choosing them?
Absolutely fundamental question. The answer is yes, yes, yes. Actually, we have been very actively working on doing a kind of census of what is the current carbon stored in cities, but also trying to develop tools that enable us to measure better and really have a kind of carbon tag for every product, not only in construction, but I would say across a kind of cross sector. I think that will give us a very important evaluation kind of criteria for many of the actions that we need to do moving forward.
Thanks a lot. We brought our really interesting webinar to an end, and as I said before, and I give you some minutes to think, and Daniel, I will put you at the end so that you can think now to the question which I have asked before. What would you think that it's the core priority for reaching climate neutrality with the support of forest? Just a sentence. would you start, Simon, again?
So just a sentence. So I think the most important thing is making sure that we can really evaluate carefully the impacts and help us reduce those impacts that we will see from climate, and also to identify what is successful in our actions. So it's a bit back to the measurement, the monitoring issues. I think this is key. Without this, we will be lost in the woods, going round in circles.
Like we are. Lucia?
Yeah, I was thinking actually quite along the same line of Simon on the importance of reliable data for tracking, for planning and tracking policies, but also to provide the right incentives to foresters, and in the agricultural sector as well, to really incentivize the actors there to do better, to do more. Through different ways. That could be also through carbon market or common agricultural policy, whatever, but the right incentives needs to be there to make the actions to be done.
Stephanie?
I might do better and just use 2 words, and I would say adaptive management is going to be key with future climate change, as well as making sure that you are adapting across the entire life cycle and across all carbon pools and stocks.
I will continue with adapted management from my side. Daniel?
Yeah, I would say, you know, if we want to manage better, we have to measure better as well. I think in general, on the kind of forestry side of things, you are doing a great effort on measuring, you know, better and better. I think architects and, you know, city leaders are not doing a good job measuring the carbon impacts yet. So I hope that could be one of the, you know, important actions in the near future.
Thank you, Simon, Lucia, Stephanie, Daniel. You have been, it was great having you, and you have been really contributing a lot to this to the success of this webinar. And Hans, thanks a lot for your presentation. Excellent work done. And before, I would wish you that a kind of, now I can't wish anybody a safe way back home, but safely unplug. I would just like to thank also my FE colleagues, all of them, from Mark, Helga, and of course Rich at the end, in everything to make this webinar successful. I think they are doing a great work. It's great that they brought all of us together. And finally, to all of you who joined us at some moment, close to 150, it's really, we really appreciate that you are proactive, not only followers, but proactive actors in our efforts that we put forests in a function of addressing some of major challenges which we are collectively facing. Thank you for being with us. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.